Hello, this is Melanie from When the Climate Crisis Claims Your Home art competition. Check our website and be part of the art competition. You can find all the information on our website. This podcast is supported by the European Solidarity Corps. Today I'm talking to Natalie Schmidthäussler. She's working as policy officer in the climate action team. I'm very happy to have you here. And maybe we could just start with you introducing yourself a little bit and also telling us why you're here today and doing this podcast with us.
Yes, of course. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm doing this podcast today because of my work at the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, where, as you already said, I'm working as part of the climate action team. And my colleague Sophie in the UNHCR Austria office approached me and introduced your initiative to me and asked whether I wanted to talk about my work. And I looked at the website and saw what you're doing. And I was really quite enthusiastic when I saw this youth-led, innovative action that you put together. And so I'm here to talk to you about my work. And my role is to support the Special Advisor on Climate Action in UNHCR, which is a relatively new position, which was only created in 2020. And I work as part of his support team to shape UNHCR's agenda on climate action. And what we do is really to coordinate all climate action within UNHCR, but also with external partners. We provide advice within the organization to all things concerning climate action. And our ultimate goal as a team is really to better protect people who are forcibly displaced in the context of climate change and disasters. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. To me, it's so great to hear that UNHCR already adapted to the global climate crisis and shapes teams to what is happening around the world. It's just, yes, great. So, what exactly is the role of UNHCR and what is your team doing exactly, like when it comes to practice?
Okay, maybe for those who are not too familiar with the work of UNHCR, let me start by saying a few words about what UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is doing generally. So we are part of the bigger United Nations family, but we have a specific mandate to protect the fundamental rights of refugees. We were established in 1950, so we just celebrated our 17th anniversary. And originally, the UNHCR was created to provide protection and assistance to the refugees after the Second World War, mainly in Europe. And what we're doing now is really leading and coordinating international action for the worldwide protection of refugees. And we're trying to find solutions for the refugee problem, which of course is not an easy task to achieve. And 70 years after our creation, we're still trying to do that. So over the years, in the past 70 years, we have been given additional responsibilities other than refugee protection, which includes responsibilities for people who are internally displaced. These are people who have been forced to flee within their own country, so they've not crossed international borders. Some people also refer to these internally displaced persons as refugees within their own borders of their own state. And UNHCR also has a responsibility for stateless populations. So these are people who have no official citizenship in any state of the world. Our headquarters is in Geneva, in Switzerland, where I'm sitting now and from where I'm talking to you. But as an organization, we are really highly decentralized. We have 7 regional bureaus and more than 130 country offices. So we operate in over 130 countries. Well, we have over 400 field offices. So we are really where the refugees are. And unfortunately, these are seldom the most comfortable and secure places in the world. What we do as an agency is mainly to provide life-saving support like food, water, or shelter for those who flee war and conflict or persecution. And we help to ensure that people who flee, who are forcibly displaced, can access their fundamental human rights, which includes, for example, education. And we also help these people to become self-sufficient in the long term. So what is part of our mandate is finding solutions for those who are forcibly displaced. And in most cases, this means enabling people to be able to return to their places of origin. Sometimes this can also mean integration in the country where they have sought asylum, but this is really just a small minority of cases, resettlement to third countries. And maybe more related to what we are going to talk about today is the fact that many people who have been displaced are no longer able to return home once a conflict is over because of environmental degradation and climate change affecting their home countries or the home regions where they are from. And so many of the regions where people have fled are now too dangerous or too fragile to support large returning populations. So this has really created new problems for us. Should I talk a bit more about what UNHCR does specifically on climate and displacement? Or
yeah, that would be great. Like that was the next question that came up. Like what changed in your work since the climate crisis really was visible? So that would be great.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So yes, UNHCR has definitely acknowledged the fact that climate crisis has affected refugees and people displaced globally. And so what we are describing as climate action mainly needs 3 different areas of work for us, which we have been doing for a long time. But since our team, the team of the Special Advisor on Climate Action, was created 1 year ago, we have really tried to sharpen this and strengthen these areas of work, which have been ongoing before, but are now becoming more and more important. We refer to these 3 areas of work as the 3 pillars of climate action. So I'm going to talk about the 3 pillars now. The first pillar is really the legal and policy guidance that we provide as a protection agency. And what we do is we really highlight and interpret the relevant legal and policy frameworks that exist for the context of climate change and disaster displacement. And what we also try to do is catalyze international discussions with states and with experts on these existing frameworks and norms that are out there, with the aim of supporting access to legal protection for people who are displaced in the context of climate change. The second pillar is what we refer to as operational response. What we do is we try to preserve and rehabilitate the natural environment where refugees are hosted. For example, if there's a large refugee settlement somewhere close to a forest, many of these refugees may cut down trees in order to gain firewood, to cook, or to keep warm. And this, of course, can have a negative impact on the environment. Of course, people have no other solution in many cases but to cut down these trees. And so what UNHCR is doing is trying to provide them with alternative access to fuel, for example, renewable energy or LPG gas, in order to protect the environments, and also rehabilitate these forests by reforesting and other environmental activities. At the same time, we are trying to work with refugees to increase their resilience to the effects of climate change through adaptation programs, many of which we do together with our partners at the World Food Programme, the UN Environmental Programme, or UNICEF. We also, and this is another important part of our work, we respond to disasters, and we also try to strengthen the preparedness of displaced populations to disasters such as flooding or drought or cyclones. One of the more recent big disasters that hit was the cyclone Idai that hit Mozambique and neighboring countries in 2019, where first it affected refugees that were already living in the region, but it also displaced many new people, some across borders, but many within their own countries. And as UNHCR, we are part of the bigger UN relief efforts. So there's many UN agencies under these circumstances that will provide assistance. UNHCR is one of them. And our third climate action pillar is what we refer to as improving UNHCR's environmental footprint. We also call it greening sometimes, or sustainability work. And this is really about improving our own environmental sustainability by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and minimizing negative impacts on the environment. In order to do so, we also gather data on how much we are actually emitting, how much energy we are using, how much diesel we are using. When we think about UNHCR field offices, many of them are really in locations where there's no connection to the national grid, for example. So what we do is that we use diesel generators to generate power, which of course is not great for the environment. And we are trying to replace these polluting generators through renewable energy sources, mostly solar plants. So this is our third area of work as the climate action team.
So that's very interesting. So you don't only work on migration as the climate action team and on people displaced and helping them, but also on yourself, like on UNHCR itself.
Yes, absolutely. And I should also say, and I should have said this before, it's not only our team who works on this. We're actually a quite small team with only 6 people. But there's other teams in UNHCR who specialize in more the legal questions, in the questions related to sustainability, and those on operation and response, much of which is done in the field. So this is really not only an effort from our team, but we just try to bring all of this together and be basically also the spokespersons for UNHCR on all of these issues. So it's a much broader effort across the organization.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So you have quite a bit experience with UNHCR and also probably know people who have even more experience, like working with UNHCR for a long time. And I'm wondering a lot, did the work in UNHCR change since people were aware of the climate crisis? Because I assume that people, refugees and people being displaced, like their situation must have changed. Or has it? Is there anything that you have noticed?
Yeah, so I would say that definitely there has been a change in not only in UNHCR but also across the international community, and how this issue has been perceived and how much we also talk about it, how much attention it gets. So for UNHCR, the most visible change is the creation of our team, and we're also working on a framework, so a document where we verbalize our position. And same has happened across many UN agencies that have developed strategies on climate change and now really take a public stance. And I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who has talked publicly a lot about climate action, about making peace with nature. So he has really put climate change at the top of his agenda. And he was also the former High Commissioner for Refugees. So he was heading UNHCR in the past. So he really gets the link with the climate crisis, what really helps the issue to become more publicly recognized. And maybe at the global scale, what I'm aware of, the first time that this link between climate change and displacement was really recognized was at the UN Climate Change Conference in Cancun in 2010 at the COP16, where the parties to the convention recognized the impact and the growing importance of climate change on the movement of people. And so they invited all parties to the convention to take measures to enhance the understanding, coordination, and cooperation with regards to climate change-induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation. So these are usually the 3 forms of human mobility that we talk about in the connection with climate change. And so this was 10 years ago. And since then, it has really gained more attention, including at the famous COP21, which included the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Displacement became more prominent with the creation of the Task Force on Displacement, which was created or established in order to develop recommendations to the United Nations Framework Convention parties to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of climate change. And this task force is really a place where different agencies that work on this issue can come together and discuss policies, develop best practices, but also see what's out there in order to avoid duplications. And of course, this task force is still active, and UNHCR is a member of it. And I think what's really important to mention is that UNHCR is not working in isolation on this issue, but really with other agencies, because the topic is just too big for one agency to solve. It's too big for one state to solve. We all know climate change, the climate crisis or climate emergency. It transcends borders, and it also transcends the mandates of individual UN agencies. So what's really important for us is working with others, including through some of the existing institutions that were already there before people started thinking really that much about the climate crisis, like the Interagency Standing Committee, which is there to coordinate efforts of many humanitarian organizations, international organizations, and NGOs to provide assistance in situations of complex emergencies. For example, when a disaster, many of which we know are linked to climate change, strikes, then the Interagency Standing Committee is there to coordinate the relief efforts of agencies, so really on an operational, practical basis. But then at the headquarter level, through the Interagency Standing Committee, UN agencies and NGOs are also working together on advocacy, on joint messaging around climate change and displacement. So we really try to speak with one voice in order to be heard. Mm-hmm. Or for example, you may have heard of the Global Compact on Refugees or the Global Compact on Migration, which are really important policy documents that have been recently developed, which also, both of them include references to climate change and environmental degradation. There's also been the development of the Nansen Protection Agenda, which deals with disaster displacement across borders, or the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk reduction. So all of these policy documents now really acknowledge this link, which is really important for us to work. So there is a basis in place for us to really work with. And this has really been a change in the past 10 years, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that all these new policies have just been developed in the last years? And like, what do they mean, like, exactly? Because I assume that to many listeners, these names maybe not mean too much. Could you break it down a little bit for not experts, what these, I would say, best practice examples would mean?
Yes, maybe, yeah, I realized that the topic is really broad, and many of the things that I brought up are definitely linked to climate and displacement, but let me maybe talk about these policies that are most important for our work at UNHCR, which is those that offer international protections for people being displaced across borders. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the 1951 Refugee Convention, which many of you may be familiar with. And the 1951 Refugee Convention is only applicable to people who are displaced in the context of climate change and displaced in a very limited number of cases, which is when it is linked, the displacement is linked to persecution or conflict and climate change and displacement. But there are regional policy, international policy instruments out there, or I should say refugee protection instruments out there that provide broader protection for people being displaced in the context of climate change and disasters. And I would like to name two, which is the OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa, better known as the OAU Convention, which is applicable to Africa. And then there's the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees for Latin America. And both of these regional refugee protection instruments include definitions of of climate change and disaster which result in seriously disturbing public order, which provide a basis for people to claim refugee status, to claim international protections when they flee across borders. So this is not automatically the case as soon as the disaster hits, but only when a state is unwilling or unable to protect people once the effects of climate change come into play or after a disaster hits. So these regional refugee instruments really offer international protection for people being forced to flee the effects of climate change. And of course, this is in some ways, this is limited to Africa and to Latin America. But what I want to say is that there are norms and instruments out there that can effectively offer protection for people forced to flee the effects of climate change. And at the same time, there's still open questions about what happens to people who do not fall under any of these conventions and are still forced to flee. And yeah, definitely more to think about here. And maybe I can also mention human rights law. I myself am not a lawyer, so bear with me. In last year, there was a very interesting case in front of the Human Rights Committee of an individual from Kiribati, a low-lying small island Pacific state, who complained to the Human Rights Committee because his asylum application to New Zealand was denied, and he was deported together with his wife and children to his home country of Kiribati. And he filed a complaint with the Human Rights Committee, arguing that by deporting him back to Kiribati, New Zealand had violated his right to life, so it violated his human rights. And because the sea level rise and other effects of climate change had rendered Kiribati uninhabitable. And this was for the first time ever, really, the Human Rights Committee ruled that countries may not deport individuals who face climate change-induced conditions that violate the right to life or other fundamental human rights. So governments, when sending people back, when deporting people, must take into account the human rights violations and the risk to life caused by climate change when considering these deportation of asylum cases. Although, and I should really mention this here, this was, although the Human Rights Committee said that this is applicable in the future, in the case of Mr. Titiota, this individual from Kiribati whose case we are talking about, the courts also said that as of now, his right to life was not violated because the situation in Kiribati was not threatening his life. They made reference to future cases where this may be applicable. So they said that in the future, there's a possibility that people may not be deported because climate change had rendered their homes uninhabitable. But in this very specific case, the person he didn't win the case, basically. Mm-hmm. But this really tells us that also human rights law can be very relevant, especially in the future when we talk about climate change and displacement. And human rights law may be used to provide protection for people fleeing their homes due to the adverse effects of climate change. And maybe just to mention some initiatives that are going on as well, that are out there and deal with these issues and try to provide better protection for people fleeing their homes. I want to mention the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is a state-led initiative, which is working towards better protection of people forced to flee the effects of disasters across borders. And the state-led initiative also develops guidelines for specific regions, mainly for states, on how they can adapt their planning and their policies to be better prepared for this disaster displacement. And there's also other guidelines out there. For example, the Words into Action guidelines, which collects good practices on how to prevent disaster displacement from happening in the first place, and also provide governments with guidance on how to include disaster displacement in their national work and also at the local level. Because we can of course, talk about policies at the global level, but we also need to make sure that these are reflected at the national, regional, and especially the local level where the work is really happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm still a bit thinking about the case you just mentioned. That is very interesting, and I'm quite sure that cases like that will appear more often in the future and are a huge challenge for human rights courts, obviously.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I agree.
Yes. So, to me, there's a big question of the future. And as a young person, I have experienced that especially the youth is very engaged in all these big questions of the future. And I also know that UNHCR has a high focus on youth work and also really wants to involve youth. So could you maybe explain a little bit and tell us how UNHCR tries to involve youth and what role the youth plays within UNHCR?
Yeah, of course. So you're definitely right in saying that youth are an important focus of UNHCR. Not least because over 30 million people who are forcibly displaced are below the age of 18. And this is 40% of all the people who are forcibly displaced in the world. And youth, so when we talk about youth, we usually talk about people aged between 15 and 24, account for 1 in 5 refugees globally. And from a UNHCR perspective, youth are a group. Usually when we talk about youth, we talk about affected youth. So those who are forcibly displaced, so internally displaced or refugees, and those who are stateless. And these youth experience greater risks. For example, they could be recruited into armed groups. Adolescent girls are a bigger risk of sexual and gender-related violence. There's a risk of neglect and exploitation and human trafficking. So at the same time, these young people that we are working with are highly resilient and very, very creative in finding ways to cope and to move forward in the face of displacement and hardship. So what we are trying to do is to promote the participation of both children and youth in processes and, of course, increase the opportunities for better education and work. What we also believe, what to be an important role of the youth is to be as agents of change within the community, since it's often the youth who adapt more easily to new thinking, and this I think holds true across the globe. So what we've done is we have created a so-called Global Youth Advisory Council, which is a consultative group for all issues related to protection and development of refugees. So it's not limited to climate and displacement, but really all issues. And it consists of a diverse group, like regionally diverse, but also gender and background, of affected youth, so internally displaced or refugee youth between the age of 18 and 25. And this group shares their perspective regularly and brings input from their own communities to the work of UNHCR. For example, members of the Global Youth Advisory Council also participated in the Youth Climate Summit last year, which was part of the UN General Assembly. So they presented their own experiences related to how climate affects their own lives and presented solutions as well to world leaders and really a broad audience. And we also organize global youth consultations regularly, where we talk to thousands of youth who are affected, mainly displaced youth, and we ask them to share their views and also their main challenges, but also possible solutions for their specific problems, which we then promote through our own work. We also created a fund where affected youth can basically apply for small funding, where they can then design and implement projects in their own communities. And there's over 100 youth-led projects that have already been implemented through this specific fund. So there's also ways in which youth are consulted when different policies are developed. And maybe just to say that, our focus is really on affected youth, so people that we work with, because for us it's clear that the people who experience these situations and these problems know best what their needs are, what their perspectives are, and also what potential solutions could look like.
It's very great. I totally agree with you that talking to affected youth is probably, the best idea, because, yes, you're right, they know what they need. But I also, for example, in the last interview I did, I talked with a young German artist, and in the interview he just came up with an idea, and he said he wants to go to the United Nations and say his idea, because he has ideas. And having been active in many grassroots movements like Fridays for Future and so on, I have realized that even not affected youth really have thoughts about that, and some of them might even have ideas they would like to tell someone, because maybe they're good. So I was wondering, is there any chance that young people can send their ideas to UNHCR, or somehow be involved and like...
No, definitely. You're absolutely right, and I think these ideas should be heard, and you should come up with ideas. It's not limited to affected youth. It's just sometimes limited capacity to where we focus our attention. But there is definitely ways for also if you're not falling under any of the affected groups, still to share your ideas and get engaged. For example, for this young artist that you mentioned, there is a Youth with Refugees art contest that UNHCR is holding every year, and which allows youth to come up with creative ways of expressing their support or solutions. And I think there's also a prize. So there's this way, but also last year, UNHCR organized the Model UN Refugee Challenge, where more than 20,000 youth took part from over 75 countries. And the task was to come up with recommendations for solutions for refugees' problems. And UNHCR and a panel of experts selected the best ideas that were created during these refugee challenges. And I think at least 2 of the 10 winners also were related to climate change and disasters. So it's really a topic that we can also see that youth have ideas about. And these all the 10 winners, including the 2 on climate, were also promoted at different big policy events that UNHCR organized and through press briefings. And there's also larger UN conferences, and I cannot speak for the entire UN system, since UNHCR alone has 17,000 staff members, let alone the whole UN system, and there is dozens of entities that specialize in different things. But maybe just to mention a few potential entry points for interested youth with great ideas about this topic, like the young artist you just mentioned. There's the UN Youth Climate Summit, which I just mentioned when I was talking about the Youth Advisory Council, which is a platform really for young leaders and people with ideas to engage and discuss these kind of opinions and ideas. And maybe the most institutionalized form of youth consultations within the UN system is the ECOSOC, which stands for Economic and Social Council, Youth Forum, which is an event that takes place on an annual basis, which is really a formalized platform for young people to make their voices heard and talk to concerned member states directly. There's also some more creative venues for interactions, like I know there's a hackathon going on, which is called Reboot the Earth, which really unites young, either tech-savvy people and scientists and innovators to develop solutions that address climate change. And of course, maybe the most obvious way, and which you know more about than I do, is to first continue what you're doing, these initiatives like the one that you're doing right now. And I mean, the protests you're organizing, they get noticed, and there's so many ways to get engaged online nowadays, especially with the restrictions that we're currently facing. And really to just get engaged in your own communities, talk to people. And maybe one more thing, and of course, when I'm saying like every one of us is part of the solution or the problem, and everyone can be an agent of change, I'm not only talking about making the right choices as a consumer and traveling, which is obvious, but also hold your decision makers accountable. Hold your politicians accountable, because without a political shift, things are going to get most likely worse. And we don't want that. We want to focus on what should be done and what's possible. Yeah, maybe.
That's very good advice. Yeah, very good. Thanks a lot. There are many options you mentioned that people can look up and participate. So yeah, it's great to have it all like compromised in this one podcast. Yeah. So I assume that you like working in your UNHCR must also be very, like, I don't know, I feel like if I would work with UNHCR, there would be many emotional moments or eye-opening moments, or just like these very big moments in life. So I was wondering if there was one moment in your career that you would like to share.
Yeah, so as you know, right now I'm in Geneva and in headquarters, which I wish had more of these moments, but it's pretty much an office job. But before I was in Geneva, I spent 2 years in Yemen, which is arguably the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. And really, it was a very, how should I say? It was a very important time for me, and I made many experiences that really reminded me of why UNHCR is doing this work, because our real work is in the field where the people are, and there I could also see the actual impact that our work has on the immediate lives of people who have been displaced. And what I also saw was a lot of resilience from the same people, and a lot of hope and ideas from the same people that should not be underestimated. So maybe moving away from just seeing people who are affected, from being passive, but of seeing them as active agents. And I remember one of these moments that you mentioned is, and there were many of them, but this one I really don't forget. It's when I was working and living in Aden, southern port city in Yemen. We quite often visited these informal settlements, which are really like not formalized camps. It's just locations where people who have fled the conflict from other regions in Yemen go and build very rudimentary, very basic shelters, quite often made of like plastic sheets and wood that UNHCR provides. And there I talked to Zara. Zara is the mother of 8 children, and it was a lovely family. And she told me about her arrival in Aden, how she really didn't want to leave her home. She said that her husband was a teacher, and he hadn't received a salary for many months, and he was still working, and they of course didn't have any money, but still they didn't want to leave, and he still continued his work. And she was always worried about her sons, especially the teenage sons, being recruited into the military, forcibly recruited, although they didn't want to have anything to do with the conflict. And then 2 of her cousins, while fetching water from a well, got hit by an airstrike and died. And still she didn't want to move. She wanted to stay in her home. Until one day an airstrike hit their house. And luckily no one in the family was hurt, but they just grabbed their bags, the few belongings like that they could grab, and just escaped as soon as they could to Aden. And really seeing how much she held on to staying at home and how much she didn't want to leave, and till her life was really in immediate danger, it just showed me once again like how little people want to leave their homes, how much they would prefer to stay if they could. And this is really something that's quite often forgotten in the public discourse. It's the fact that people don't take this decision to leave their home lightly, which is really illustrated like in this example of Zara. But of course, every story is different. But I think this is a fact that unites many people who are forcibly displaced, that they don't take this decision lightly, and that they would prefer to stay at home, and they're really just leaving because they have no other option.
Wow, that's a very, very strong story. Mm-hmm. Especially to experience this. If I would think about having to leave Austria, I wouldn't want to do that either. So I assume that everyone is bound to their homes, and no one really wants to take such a dangerous journey and leave the home and leave everything behind. Like, yes.
Yeah. Especially not knowing when you can ever go back.
Yeah. That must be very hard. That must be like, I think right now we experience this uncertainty during the COVID-19 pandemic. And maybe this is the first time for us privileged people to experience uncertainty that other people experience for years. So maybe that helps us to at least, understand how they feel a little bit better. Yes.
Yeah.
So I ask you quite a lot of questions now. I want to give you the option to, if there is anything else that you would like to share with us, if there's anything that you would like to say.
Maybe just maybe 2 points. So one general observation that I just want to share here is that quite often displacement in the context of climate change is referred to as a future problem, as people will be moving, and then quite often people say that these people will be knocking on the doors of Europe and they will all come to Europe. And I just want to say that, first of all, it's not only a future problem. It may get worse, yes, it may get more urgent, but people are already being displaced in the context because of the consequences of climate change. So it's a ongoing problem that is only set to get worse. But at the same time, most of these people are not going to come to Europe. This is just a myth and not based on facts. Most people are going to be displaced within their own countries, or at least within their own regions. Most of the displacement, including the displacement as a result of climate change, is taking place from rural to urban areas. So it's really the urban areas in the places most affected by climate change that are going to experience the consequences of this displacement the hardest, the strongest. And maybe my second point is maybe a word of caution, that the displacement, including as a result of climate change, is multi-causal. Like it's very rare that people you can very clearly say someone has been displaced just as a consequence of climate change. Also, climate change doesn't persecute a person. It's quite often the adverse effects of climate change that together with other factors force people to leave their homes. For example, climate change can make it much more difficult to sustain a livelihood or to access water, or that it can aggravate conflicts or tensions that are already going on in the region. Rarely will climate change, if there's zero basis for conflict, create a new conflict. So it's usually underlying tensions that are aggravated by climate change, or the scarcity of natural resources, which forces people to flee, can get aggravated by climate change. But it's usually really this multi-causality and the fact that climate change works as a risk multiplier or as a threat multiplier that makes people move. So yeah, maybe just these 2 points as my last words.
Thanks a lot. Yes, these 2 points are very important. And it's also great to hear this from you working with UNHCR, because I think most of our listeners have heard this from different sources that might not have been that reliable. And now that you're saying that, it's very, very great. Yes. Thanks a lot for these words.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. It has really been a pleasure talking to you. And I'm really enthusiastic about your initiative, and I'm looking forward to seeing the winner of the art contest as well.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. Thanks for taking the time too, and yes, having this nice interview.
Thank you so much.